I never believed in the power of coincidence until the day I met Owen. I was 17, quiet, observant, and mostly invisible in the halls of Millstone High. My days were predictable. I sat in the second row of Mr. Carter's literature class, ate lunch under the old maple tree in the back of the school, and went home to my grandmother's small house where I lived since my parents died. I didn't talk much, not because I was shy, but because I had long learned that silence was safer than misinterpretation. Then, one rainy afternoon, in late September, Owen barged into my life quite literally, by sliding across the wet cafeteria floor, crashing into my table, and spilling both his tray and mine. He was tall, loud, and full of chaotic energy, with a mop of curly brown hair and a grin that seemed to be permanently carved into his face. While I was busy gathering my soaked sandwich and wiping ketchup off my notebook, he looked up from the floor, laughed, and said, "Well, that's one way to make a first impression." That was Owen, unbothered, unfiltered, and unapologetically alive. I expected him to walk away after that awkward encounter. Most people did. But Owen, for some reason, decided that I was interesting. The next day, he sat next to me during lunch like we had been friends for years. He talked, a lot, about anything and everything: his dog, named Pluto, his dream to build his own video game, his theory that cafeteria spaghetti was secretly made from recycled erasers. I listened, at first reluctantly, then curiously. He never asked me to talk, he just talked, and waited, and slowly, I began to reply, one word at a time. Over the weeks, our conversations grew. I discovered that Owen was more than just the class clown. He was thoughtful, smart in ways that didn't show up in test scores, and fiercely loyal to the few people he cared about. I also learned that he carried shadows behind his smile. He lived with his older brother, since his parents had moved overseas for work. He didn't like talking about them, and I didn't ask. Some silences deserved to be respected. We started meeting outside school. At first, it was to work on a group project, but then, it became a routine. Friday afternoons at the arcade. Saturdays at the park with Pluto. Sundays at the library, where Owen pretended to study, but mostly doodled in the margins of borrowed books. I had never had a real friend before, the kind who shows up when it rains, not just when the sun shines. Owen was that kind. He didn't just fill the silence, he honored it. One evening in October, we sat on the roof of my grandmother's garage, staring at the stars. Owen tossed me a bag of chips and said, "You know, I used to think people like us don't end up in stories." I asked what he meant. He shrugged. People who are broken, weird, not the main characters. I looked at him and said, "Maybe we're just in the middle of the story, not the end." He smiled at that, and for a long moment we just watched the night sky breathe. Then winter came. Winter arrived slowly, like a whisper at first, a chill in the wind. A hint of frost on the morning grass, then suddenly, all at once, with snow draping the town in silence and gray skies that hung low for days. Millstone High felt different in the winter. The noise of the halls was muffled under layers of jackets and scarves, and people moved faster, heads down, eager to escape the cold. But somehow, in the middle of all that grayness, my world felt brighter. Maybe it was Owen. Maybe it was the way he made even the dullest moments feel like a secret worth sharing. We still sat together every lunch. We still talked, or didn't talk, in a way that only real friends understand. Then, sometime in early December, Owen started to change. Not suddenly, but in pieces. He'd show up late to school, eyes tired, hoodie pulled over his face. He laughed less. Some days he didn't come at all. When I asked, he'd wave it off with a joke or a lie, so obvious it didn't need calling out. Aliens abducted me. My dog started a cult. I had to fight off a snowman uprising. I smiled, but inside I felt something tighten. One Friday, he skipped our arcade meetup without a word. That had never happened before. The next Monday, he showed up with a bruise near his temple and a crack in the corner of his smile. I wanted to ask, but I didn't. Not then. I wasn't sure if I had the right. But I watched him more closely. His laugh became something he used like a shield. His hands fidgeted when he was quiet, tapping patterns on the table, like he was trying to hold something inside. And still, he came. Still, he sat beside me. That mattered more than anything he said. A week before winter break, we were walking home after school. The snow had started again, light and slow, like the sky was trying to remember how to cry. We talked about nothing, what movies we hadn't seen, what food we hated, how Pluto had eaten his math homework. Then, just as we reached the corner where we usually split, Owen stopped. "Hey," he said, "can I tell you something kind of heavy?" I nodded. He took a breath, the kind that fills up the chest and squeezes the heart. Sometimes, sometimes it feels like I'm not really here. Like I'm just acting like a person, hoping no one notices I'm faking it. He didn't say anything, just nodded and looked away, his eyes shining in the streetlight. Then he said, quietly, "Thanks for not leaving." He didn't say anything, just nodded and looked away, his eyes shining in the streetlight. Then he said, quietly, "Thanks for not leaving." And we stood there, in the falling snow, two people holding on to the silence, like it was something sacred. When he walked away that night, I realized something that scared me. I wasn't just his friend, I needed him too. Not because he was funny or kind, though he was both. But because he saw me, really saw me. And I didn't want to go back to being invisible. But needing someone that much comes with risk. And I didn't know then just how much was about to change. The days leading up to winter break were a blur of falling snow, final exams, and the distant sound of holiday music echoing through the school's intercom. But none of it felt quite real. Something in Owen had shifted, and even though he still showed up, still cracked his usual jokes and tried to act like nothing was wrong, I could see the difference. His eyes didn't match his smile anymore. His laughter didn't reach his shoulders. And he was quieter, not in the way I used to be, but in the way people are when they're carrying something too heavy to share. On the last day before break, we sat together in the back of the library, surrounded by shelves of forgotten books and the warmth of the old radiator. Outside, the snow was falling fast now, thick and steady. Owen leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. Ever feel like, if you stopped showing up, no one would really notice? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, at the boy who had barged into my quiet world with his storm of energy and turned everything inside out. "I'd notice," I said. "Every day." He opened his eyes and looked at me for a long time, like he was trying to decide whether or not to believe me. Then he nodded slowly and said, "Thanks. That matters more than I thought it would." Then came the silence. After that day, Owen disappeared. Not just from school but from everywhere. He didn't text, didn't answer calls, didn't show up at the arcade or the park or the library. At first, I thought maybe he'd gone on a trip for the holidays. But when school resumed in January, and he still hadn't returned, the worry started to settle in my bones. I asked around. Teachers said he hadn't withdrawn, just on leave. No one seemed to know anything. Or maybe they did, and just didn't say. Weeks passed. Snow melted into slush. Hallways grew louder again, but everything felt hollow. I went through the motions, but without Owen, the color had drained from my world. Every time I passed the table where we used to sit, something inside me ached. It was strange, how someone who had once been a stranger could become so essential. Stranger still, how quickly that presence could vanish, leaving behind only echoes. Then, one afternoon, in early February, a letter arrived. Not a text, not an email, a real letter, folded neatly in an envelope with my name written in Owen's crooked handwriting. Inside was a single page. "I'm sorry for disappearing. I didn't want to drag you into my mess. I thought it would be easier if I just left before things got worse. But I realize now that maybe that was selfish. You were the first person who really saw me. And I didn't know how to handle that. I still don't, but I wanted to say thank you for being there, for noticing. I don't know what comes next, but I needed you to know it wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. You did everything right. That's what scared me the most." I read it again, and again, and again. The page shook in my hands, not from cold, but from everything that filled the spaces between his words. I didn't know where he was. I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this be the end of our story. I kept Owen's letter in the inside pocket of my backpack, folded carefully along the same creases, like a fragile artifact. I read it during lunch, between classes, sometimes in the dark when I couldn't sleep. Every time, I wondered where he was when he wrote it. Was he safe? Was he alone? Had he really meant to disappear forever? It took me a week to gather the courage to act. Part of me worried that reaching out would break something delicate, that pushing too hard would make him retreat further. But the greater part of me, the part he had helped uncover, the part that had learned how to care out loud, knew that letting go in silence wasn't an option. So I started small. I went by his house. It was a modest one-story on the east side of town, faded blue with a crooked mailbox and a chain-link fence that Pluto used to jump over. The curtains were drawn. No lights inside. I knocked. No answer. I left a note in the mailbox. Just wanted to say hi. I miss you. Hope you're okay. A few days later, I passed by again. The note was gone. No reply, but that was something. I asked his neighbors, carefully. Most of them didn't know much, just that Owen's older brother had been seen leaving with a duffel bag. that the house seemed empty lately. One older woman across the street said she thought Owen had gone to live with a relative somewhere north, but she wasn't sure. It wasn't enough. I needed more. So I did something I hadn't done before. I wrote him a letter. Not a text, not a message. A real letter. I told him about school, about how weird it was to eat lunch alone again, about the time someone set off a stink bomb in the boys' bathroom and the whole science wing had to be evacuated. I told him how Pluto's name still came up in my head every time I saw a dog with floppy ears. I told him I hoped he was okay. I didn't ask where he was. I just wrote like he was listening. Then I wrote another the next week, and another. I dropped them in his mailbox, even though I wasn't sure anyone was checking it. Still, I wrote. 3 weeks in, I came home to find an envelope on my doorstep. There was no return address. Just my name, in familiar handwriting. Inside, a single sentence. You didn't have to look for me, but you did. That means more than you'll ever know. I sat on the porch steps for a long time, holding that paper like it might evaporate if I blinked. I didn't need more than that. I just needed to know he was still there, still reachable. After that, we began to write. Not often, not predictably, but enough. Enough to stitch something back together, one word at a time. His letters were short, sometimes just a few lines, but they were real, honest. No more jokes to hide behind, just truth in its rawest form. Eventually, he told me where he was, his aunt's house, in a small town a few hours north. He said it was quiet there, cold, that he was thinking of finishing the school year remotely. That some days were better than others. I wrote back that I'd be here whenever he came back. That he didn't have to rush, but he didn't have to disappear, either. He wrote, I'm trying. I don't know how to be okay. But I remember what you said, that maybe we're just in the middle of the story, not the end. I think I want to keep writing the rest. That was the first time I let myself cry, not out of sadness, but relief, hope, because in a world where people come and go, where silence so often swallows everything, someone had stayed. We had stayed. And somehow, against the odds, that still mattered. The first time I heard Owen's voice again, not through paper, but through the static of a phone call, it was a quiet Sunday morning. My phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I answered. Hey, he said, and his voice was softer than I remembered, but unmistakably his. I don't really know how to start this. I almost didn't call. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't need to. Silence had always been a language between us, two. I miss the library, he continued. And Pluto misses the park, and I miss sitting beside someone who doesn't expect me to pretend. That was Owen, still learning how to speak without a mask, still braver than he knew. I told him I missed him too, that nothing really felt the same without him. That people had started asking about him, some sincerely, some out of routine, but that none of them knew him like I did. He laughed at that. A quiet, real laugh. You always saw too much, he said. But I think I needed that. Over the next few weeks, the phone calls came more often, sometimes short, sometimes long, sometimes silent. But always real. He started telling me about his life up north, his aunt's strange obsession with baking muffins. The quiet streets that made the nights feel too big. The local library that smelled like lemon polish and old ink. He was still Owen, but slower, more thoughtful, like he was relearning how to move without breaking. Then one day, in late March, he said, "I think I want to come back. Not just visit, not just pass through. Come back." "I don't know if I'm ready," he admitted. "But I don't think I ever will be. And maybe that's not the point." I told him the truth, that no one ever feels completely ready to return. That sometimes, we just choose to return anyway and let everything else catch up. And so he did. It wasn't dramatic. There was no big announcement, no crowd waiting, just a Tuesday morning, a school hallway, and the familiar sound of footsteps behind me. I turned, and there he was, hoodie, backpack, Pluto keychain swinging from the zipper. Same grin, maybe a little more tired, maybe a little more real, but still Owen. I couldn't help it. Terribly, I said. "There's a new rumor now that it's just dyed rubber bands." He grinned. "See, leave for a few months and the whole food pyramid collapses." We sat under the maple tree during lunch, even though it was still too cold, and the ground was still too damp. We talked, we didn't talk. We just existed in the same space again, and that was enough. People stared. Some came up to say hello. Some asked questions. Owen answered when he felt like it, ignored them when he didn't. I stayed beside him, like always, not as a shield, not as a guide, just as a friend. A presence. That afternoon, as we walked home, he looked at me and said, "You know, I thought disappearing would keep you from seeing the worst parts of me. But you saw them anyway, and stayed." I didn't say anything. I just reached over and bumped his shoulder with mine. He smiled. "I think that's what real friendship is," he said. "Not just staying through the best parts, but choosing each other even when it's hard." And I knew, in that moment, that he was right. We weren't the same as we had been last fall. We were scarred, quieter, maybe even a little older in the ways that mattered. But we were still us. And for now, that was more than enough. Spring came late that year. The trees hesitated, the sky kept changing its mind. And everything felt caught between seasons, not quite winter, not yet summer. It matched how we felt. Owen was back, but the world hadn't simply stitched itself up. There were quiet days. Off days. Days where I could tell he was fighting battles he didn't always name. And I didn't always know how to help. One afternoon, we sat behind the school, legs stretched out on the concrete ledge where the wall was cracked and the ivy had started to grow again. He was tossing pebbles at the rusted fence while I read a book I wasn't really paying attention to. Then he asked, "What would you do if you found out someone lied to you because they were scared?" I looked at him. His voice was tight, controlled, and something in his posture had changed. I closed the book and said, "Depends on the lie, and the reason, but mostly, I'd want to know the truth, even if it hurts." He didn't respond at first, just kept tossing stones. Finally, he said, "The reason I left. It wasn't just about being overwhelmed, or burned out, or depressed. I mean, it was all of that. But also, I got in trouble." He paused. "Serious trouble." I didn't move, didn't speak. just waited. He inhaled slowly, like pulling the truth out of himself was a painful process. There was this night. I got into a fight with someone. Nothing huge, just stupid yelling, pushing. But it happened outside a store, and there were cameras. The guy's dad pressed charges, said I threatened him. I didn't, I swear, I didn't. But I was angry, loud, and I looked guilty enough. I swallowed. My heart beat a little faster, but not from fear, from the weight of what he'd been carrying alone. I didn't tell you, he said, because I was ashamed. And I didn't want you to see me like that. Like a ... problem, a mistake. I looked at him, and I saw the boy who had sat with me in silence, who had written letters when his voice failed, who had disappeared not out of apathy but out of fear. I didn't see a mistake. I saw a human being. Owen, I said, you didn't have to be perfect for me to stay, you just had to be honest. His hands were trembling now, just a little, enough that I noticed. So, you still trust me, he asked. Even now, I nodded. Especially now. Something in him seemed to break hand, then rebuild stronger. His shoulders dropped, his hands relaxed. He leaned back, staring up at the sky like for the first time in months, he could finally breathe right. After that day, something changed between us. There were no more half-truths, no more performances. We talked about the messy parts, the angry parts, the fragile parts. We didn't always have the right words, but we learned to listen in a way that mattered. The end of the school year came quickly, too quickly. One afternoon, we sat in our usual spot, the air thick with the smell of summer coming. Owen turned to me and said, "Do you ever think about how none of this was supposed to happen?" I smiled. "You mean, you barging into my life and ruining my peace?" He laughed. "Exactly that." I shook my head. "No. I think maybe it was always supposed to happen, just not in the way we expected." He looked at me then, not with the guarded expression he used to wear, but with something gentler, wiser. "Thank you," he said, "for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on myself." And I said, "Thank you for coming back. Even when it scared you." The bell rang. We stood up, walked side by side toward the last week of school, the last chapter of a long, complicated year. Some people build bridges with steel and stone. We built ours with letters, silences, broken pieces, and the stubborn, quiet belief that we were worth holding on to. And in the end, that bridge held. It's been 5 years. Sometimes, I still catch myself walking past the old maple tree behind the school, half expecting to see Owen sitting there, tossing pebbles into the dirt, that familiar crooked smile on his face. The tree's taller now, stronger, like us. After high school, we went in different directions, different cities, different dreams, but the bridge never broke. We still talk. Not every day, not even every week. But the bonds, they're woven into the architecture of who we became. When he calls, it's like no time has passed. When he writes, I still fold his letters the same way I did when I was 17. Owen found his rhythm. He studied psychology. Said he wanted to understand how minds bend without breaking. He works now at a youth center, helping kids who remind him of who he used to be: angry, scared, lost. I think he became the person he once needed. There's something beautiful in that. As for my write, not just letters anymore, but essays, short stories, and sometimes whole pages that never see the light of day. But all of them carry a thread that traces back to that one friendship. That one year. That one boy who sat beside me and taught me that silence can be sacred, that honesty can hurt but still heal. And that showing up for someone, for yourself is, sometimes, the bravest thing you can do. I think about him often, not because I miss the past, but because I carry it with me, like a compass, like a promise. People always ask if I believe in soulmates. I tell them I do. But not just in the romantic way people expect. Sometimes, a soulmate is a friend. Someone who sees the worst in you and stays. Someone who shows you the version of yourself you forgot you could become. Owen was that for me. Still is. We weren't perfect. We didn't have to be. But we were real. And in the end, that was everything.